Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. Please don't forget you've got your first paper coming up, so just make sure that you're working on that. I sent you this morning my official office hours for the semester, so I'm not going to be able to have them today, unfortunately. I apologize for that, and I won't next Friday either, but otherwise they should be normal, aside from missing 2 Fridays in a row. So I apologize for that, but if you want to talk, especially next week, to talk about your paper, it'd be good for you to come on in and just check those out. Again, I sent those via email. So this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to look at Herodotus and we're going to look at Heraclitus and try and figure out exactly what we can learn about the Greek mind and the order of the Greek mind by looking at these 2 figures. So as Gwen very kindly reminded me just a moment ago, I wanted to start with philosophy because we ended with philosophy on Wednesday, but I only got into it a little bit, so I'm going to repeat myself to a certain extent, but I want to take it a little bit further than what we had done as well. So please remember that as the Greeks are trying to figure out who and what we are as human persons, they become absolutely obsessed with the idea of cycles and finding us within these cycles. So as we talked about on Wednesday, we have this cycle of birth, middle age, and death, and we individually are never repeated, but the human person keeps going. That is, humanity keeps going. And so every one of us then is uniquely born into a time and a place. We're born to a certain set of parents. We're born into a certain community. We're born into a certain, generally, religion. We're born into a certain language. We're born into certain circumstances. And those are things that we all understand as being a part of the order of justice, as we've talked about justice in this class. But we also have to think about it in terms of trying to understand this continuity. So justice, not just the individual within his or her place in society, but in understanding the very continuity of the human being as well, and human beings. So the Greeks looked at things like nature, and especially the idea that we have summer and then fall and then winter and spring, but you don't have a fifth thing. You go back to the first thing. And all of this really worried the Greeks because they thought maybe we were trapped in these cycles that we could never escape. So it wasn't enough to see the kind of beauty in this, but it was also a fearsome thing that somehow we as human beings could never escape the circles or the cycles of this earth, that we simply wouldn't get out of that. So this is one of their great concerns, and this is why when you get, for example, to the New Testament and you find St. Paul describing Jesus, especially in his letter to the Colossians, as that being who connects all things through the cross, you're escaping, finally. And much of what we see in the New Testament is an attempt to answer what the Greeks have been asking for a very long time. And of course, the New Testament's written in Greek. All of it is written in Greek. And it was meant to try and address that Greek population and those questions that the Greeks had. But the other thing that the Greeks were fascinated about was not just that we were trapped in these cycles, but they wanted to know what was the beginning of all things. So how did we start? Who was the first human? How did we have the first tree? When did we have the first season? And they wanted to know how could we perpetuate ourselves within the cycle, especially trying to figure out where we came from. And so the earliest Greek philosophers, and these guys really were, I mean, they're amazing. People like Thales and Heraclitus and others, but they really were wise men, roughly about 510 BC in this little town called Miletus, and they're trying to ask what is then what we would call the first principle, that is the beginning of all things, what Aristotle will later call the prime mover, or what we call God. And so they're trying to figure this out, and they break it down into the possibility of the 4 elements. So one person argues that we're all earth, from dust to dust, right? Another person argues that we are air in some way. Another person argues we are water in some way. And the most important one for us is Heraclitus, the philosopher, who argues that we're fire. And so the idea was that there had been this kind of primary element or this primary thing like fire or earth or wind or water. And somehow it had fallen apart. This is where we come from. We come from the disintegration of these various elements. But then somehow to keep our own human being going, that is individually as well as a species, we had to figure out how can we try and bring ourselves back as a whole? How can we reconnect the thing that had broken? And the Greeks never understood, why did this all fall apart? That is, why did we have a pure fire that fell apart? Why did we have a pure water that fell apart? And so they never quite get it in terms of trying to understand where we come from. All they argued was we came from one of these four elements, but somehow we had to return. And it means that if there is a God, that God is represented by one of those elements, one of those four elements. And the reason that we focus so much on Heraclitus and his understanding of fire is he gives us a term. He makes up a word. As far as we know, he made up the word. It may have existed prior to him, but it seems as though it came from him. And he comes up with this term that he calls logos. And logos means fire. It means word. It means speech. And one of the weirdest things about ancient Greek, and I'm no ancient Greek scholar by any means, but one of the weird things about ancient Greek is that in the language, unlike in English, where we have words that mean this or that, in ancient Greek, a thing always meant this and that, and that, and that. So you couldn't separate fire from breath, or fire from word, or fire from speech. They were all those things at once. So the logos is imagination, it's speech, it's fire, it's all of these things. And this, I hope, should be making sense for everybody, because obviously when St. John begins his gospel and he gives us those first 14 lines, they are all about the meaning of logos. And of course, that means that the New Testament writers are taking this ancient understanding of the Greeks and they're sanctifying it. They're making it holy in some way. So logos becomes the term for really set the next 600 years for trying an understanding, or at least an attempt to understand, what is it that connects us to the God. And so here again, speech, reason, all of these things are connected. So actually reason is a synonym for logos, and it's one reason that we talk about people being endowed with reason. We're really saying they're endowed with logos. So this is what Heraclitus argued and gives us this term, and he does argue that there is a God, and he is, more or less monotheistic, but it's kind of pantheism more than anything else. So the God, the logos of Heraclitus, is definitely not the logos of St. John's Gospel. St. John's Gospel has taken it in such a different direction. So I don't want, by saying logos, don't think that that Heraclitus has Jesus in mind. Maybe God implanted that in some way, but it would be a really big stretch. I think more the logos for someone like Heraclitus is almost like this big abstract brain or abstract mind, if anything else. So it's not that personal incarnational understanding that we get in Christianity. That's going to be something different. The logos incarnate is different from the logos as it exists. But anyway, my whole point here is that this is all an attempt by the early philosophers to try and figure out who and what we are. And these are the first philosophical questions. So remember, philosophy means love of wisdom, and it is a desire to understand and glorify wisdom and to make wisdom itself this object of desire in some way or another. Okay, Sam.
You said that the logos, you're separating the logos of St. Paul.
Right.
With the connection towards God, but they believe it was like kind of a divine thing, right? It wasn't just...
Oh, that people like Heraclitus thought it was divine?
Right.
Yeah, but again, in a kind of pantheistic way. So they're not imagining like we imagine God the Father, God the Son, or even God the Holy Spirit. They're not imagining it in any way personal like that. It's a huge impersonal force that holds all things together.
Right. Okay.
So don't think of it, and don't think of it like Zeus either. It's not a god with personality at all. It's just really an abstraction more than anything else. Yeah. And if they envisioned it, they may have envisioned it as a kind of just a flame kind of idea.
So it was spiritual, just not a person.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a good way. It did have a spiritual quality to it, but so just you and I talking right now, Sam, the fact that we can speak to one another is the gift of Logos. It's the gift of reason. So Logos is present not only in what I'm saying, but in our actual dialogue, you and me at the moment. It's present. So it's not, that's where it becomes kind of pantheistic. It's like anything we do that somehow engages in reason or communication is a reflection of the Logos in some way. Now, you think about what John says, St. John. St. John in 1:9 of his gospel does say it is the light that lighteth up every man. So it's more that if Heraclitus is here, St. John is way, 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 way up here. But clearly, I mean, St. John, we take, for those of us who come from a Christian background, we take this as the Word of God. But St. John could have chosen another term as well. But the fact that he chooses this ancient concept and chooses Logos is very telling that he's trying to answer the Greeks.
Okay.
Yeah. Whether that's God speaking through him or not, right, as a matter of faith. But yeah, so good. Okay, anybody else on this or on philosophy? Okay, so I told you at the beginning of the class, not this specific class, but at the beginning of the semester, that I would expect you to know the virtues as well. And now's the time I want to talk about the virtues for a moment, especially before we get into Pericles, but with Herodotus as well. So virtue is this concept, and it's interesting that we use the term virtue, because virtue is actually a Latin virtu, meaning a manly power. There isn't really a Greek equivalent for the word virtue. There is one called arete, which means excellence, but it's a little bit different than what virtue is. So the Greeks had a concept of virtue, but they talked about the individual virtues rather than the concept of virtue itself. And in the middle of one of the dialogues that we have, that we still have, right, one of the dialogues that's remained in history, this dialogue called the Symposium. It's not one we're going to read or reference beyond this. But in a dialogue called the Symposium, there's a moment where the characters, and Socrates is one of them, the characters suddenly say, well, we all agree that excellence is four things. It's prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And nobody, and unlike almost every other Socratic dialogue where you get these debates, well, no, it can't be prudence first, it'd have to be, that everybody just agrees. So our basic historical understanding is the Greeks already had this concept by the time that Plato's writing this, and everybody had just kind of accepted what these virtues were. Again, even though virtue is kind of an odd term because it's a later Roman term, Latin term, and not a Greek term. But virtue literally means virtu, or the power of man, the power of humanity. And so there's a great moment for those of you who've ever read the King James Version of the Bible. There's the great moment, of course, this is in every version of the Bible, but the way it's described in the King James is specific. There's a moment where a woman in the crowd is trying to touch Jesus' cloak. And as she does it, she touches his cloak, and the King James Version says that virtue flowed from Jesus into her. And that's an excellent way of thinking about what virtue is. There, of course, you've got someone who's fully man and fully God, so it makes it a little bit more complicated. But virtue is this power that we have of doing good or of doing well. And so the virtues become very important. And this is the way that Socrates, in that dialogue, puts it, that there is prudence, justice. Of course, we've already talked about justice, but we'll go over it again. Prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. these are the 4 virtues. And I want you to know all of them. And I may even do a special quiz on this. So make sure that you know these. So prudence is the ability to discern good from evil. That is, when I analyze a situation or I analyze a discussion or a person or a thought or even a thing, I have the ability to discern what is good about it from what is ill about it. So prudence we often use in the modern world as a kind of odd, we'll say he acted prudently, meaning he didn't jump into the fray. Right? So prudence becomes this almost caution, and that's not at all what it means originally. In fact, it's quite the opposite of caution, because you have to make the choice and decide whether the thing is good or evil. So prudence is that ability to do that. Lucy, did you have a question? No, I thought you raised your hand. Okay. So prudence is the ability to discern good from evil. Justice as the second virtue then, and prudence is always considered the first of the pagan virtues. By the way, what I'm giving you here, these 4, sometimes they're called the classical virtues, sometimes they're called the pagan virtues. Either is fine, but we're talking about the early pre-Christian virtues, essentially. Christianity will add faith, hope, and love. Right? This is what Paul adds in Corinthians. And so we get 7 virtues total. And so that you should keep that in mind. I'm only giving you the 4 right now, but the 7 are what we'll have by the end of the semester. Certainly by the middle of the semester, we'll be at all 7. Okay, so prudence is the ability to discern good from evil. Justice is to give each person his or her due. That is to recognize that person within the context of much greater things, not only the context of his neighbors, but the context of his ancestors as well. And this is, you probably haven't started reading the Credo yet, but so much of the Credo is a meditation on what justice is, what duty, and prudence as well. But what duty does Socrates have to the community of Athens? What does he owe that community? Does he owe it anything? And if so, does he owe it only for the current moment, that is, for the city of Athens as it existed right then, or does he owe it to Athens over time? That is, does he still owe something to the Athens of his grandparents and to the Athens of his great-great-grandchildren who are still to come? Right? How does he understand that? Or is it just the Athens of his day? The same kind of thing at Hillsdale we talk about a lot when we think about America. You guys will be, no matter how, and I hope you all love Hillsdale. I absolutely love Hillsdale. But by the time you graduate, you'll probably be ready to take a break from talking about the founding. Right? It's just, you're going to hear about the founding all the time in your 4 years here. And it's great, don't get me wrong, but there becomes a moment where you're saturated. It's like, oh yeah, I don't think I can think about George Washington any longer. But that's part of that context of justice. We're trying to figure out, where do we fit in? So we're Americans of 2021, but does that mean we owe allegiance to Americans of 1776? And do we owe allegiance to Americans of 2076? I'm not going to make it that long, but you guys will. So where are we gonna be then? And so how do we think about ourselves now? So justice is not just at the moment, but it's overall. And we get certain things from justice, which we haven't talked about yet. We get things like rights, because our right is knowing our right place in the order of things. And one of the things that our founders said was that we are endowed by natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because that's the justice of the situation. We know our right place being lower than God, but higher than the animals. So justice is this very complicated thing. And as I asked you to think about, 2 weeks ago now, or a week ago when we started class, week and a half ago, what I asked you to think about was that these people believe these to be objectively true. So there is in the heavens an objectively true prudence, and there is an objectively true justice in some way. But because we are here and now, and we've got, 17 people in the room, to understand justice, we would probably have 17 different visions and ideas about what that justice is. We can still all believe there is an absolute justice, but we recognize that because we're flawed, we don't understand exactly what that justice is. Right? Okay, good. So keep that in mind. And then we get to the third of the virtues, and this is temperance. And temperance is very much related to the first two. In fact, you really can't separate one virtue from the others. But temperance is the idea that whatever the created goods are, they must be used for good itself. So anything that we receive, if we grow rice or if we grow wheat, that wheat must be for the common good. If we have a talent that we've been given, maybe we've been given the talent of friendship or listening, that talent must be used then for the common good. It must be used for everybody's benefit. So even our individual excellences, which are individual and unique to each one of us, these excellences are still meant to make the community better in some way. So there's a great, for those of you who go to a liturgical church, if you're Lutheran or Catholic or Anglican or Orthodox, one of the lines that's said when you prepare for communion is that this wheat, which has been given to us by God, has been remade through human hands to be then sanctified by God itself. This is an absolute explanation of temperance within the church. It's a great idea because here it is. What's happened? Well, we grew the wheat, but the wheat was given to us by God originally. We remade the wheat into bread. God then sanctified the bread and made it his body. Right? That you can't get a more absolute definition of temperance or a better one than that example. That is temperance. So here again, we mess this up. In the modern world, we tend to think temperance means refraining from excess, especially when it comes to things in America like drinking too much. Yeah, you definitely should not drink too much. That's just wise. Believe me, it's just very wise not to drink too much. But that has nothing to do with temperance. Temperance is the use of the created goods for good. That's what it means. So, as Paul tells us, there's nothing wrong with taking a little red wine for your stomach. Right? That you don't abstain from all of something. That would actually be intemperate. That would be saying, well, thanks God for the created good, but it's not good enough for me. In other words, it's you basically telling God that God made a mistake in something. And so temperance didn't go that way. Temperance was about moderation, but only moderation in the fact that you use whatever you've been given for good. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay, so temperance, the use of the created goods for good. And then finally, fortitude. And fortitude is a virtue that probably in some ways we have too much of in the modern world. In other ways, we don't have enough. We use fortitude sometimes too often to kind of beat somebody over the head with something, especially on social media. But fortitude means that you will promote the good no matter the cost. So even if that cost, like with Leonidas, leads to his death, he is doing something that is endowed with fortitude. Now, just out of curiosity, think about those four virtues. They all are related one to another, but out of curiosity that I have, do they all fit perfectly well together? Isn't fortitude kind of an outlier? And this idea that you will do anything to promote the good? It doesn't quite mesh, not totally anyway. It doesn't quite mesh with the first three virtues. The first three virtues go together beautifully. But then you get this one that says, no matter the cost. And believe me, it's a virtue. I'm not in any way questioning fortitude as a virtue. It may be the highest of these virtues. But one of the great things that Christianity does, and it does many things just historically, whether you believe in it as a faith or not, one of the great things that Christianity does is it provides a marker for each of these things. So we know exactly how to be prudent, how to be temperate, how to have fortitude, because we know what love is. And it is very difficult to balance these four without the Christian virtue of love. And so love will be one of those things. Obviously, it's the highest of all virtues, and it's certainly the highest of Christian virtues. But it also means that if we're going to have fortitude, it has to be for something good. And that good can only be judged by what is loved or what is loving and what is not. So I don't mind talking about the pagan virtues in and of themselves, but there's a reason that the Christian virtues add to them and make them better in some way. So we have that marker. Love, of course, is the willingness to give of oneself to another. It's that simple, the willingness to give of oneself to another. So we'll get into those later when we get into Christianity. But I did want you to know these virtues for now. So does anybody have any questions about any of this? Anything we've talked about with the virtues? Or yeah, Lucy.
Can you go further into what makes fortitude an outlier?
It's an outlier only because there are certain things. It's one of those all goods. Everything that's good can be perverted. Love is the easiest thing to pervert by far, and fortitude is one of those things that, because it says essentially you have to be extreme to do the right thing, it allows itself to become extreme. And so it's easy for someone with fortitude to lose sight of the other virtues because they become so obsessed with a cause, and that cause becomes everything for them, and they can't let it go. And you really do in social media, you see this a lot, where you get this kind of peer pressure, and people will gang up on somebody and they cancel them, and they become so righteous in their cause that they're blinded to the actual humanity of the person that they're arguing against. That's what I mean by fortitude being an outlier. So does that make sense?
Very much.
Okay. So fortitude is a good thing. It is an extremely good thing, and we should have fortitude. But if we lose sight of the fact that our opponent is also made in the image of God, then we've lost sight of what the fortitude really is about as well. We've made fortitude an idol or a god then. And it's just, of all the virtues, it's the easiest one to kind of mess up and not balance well. Yeah, Sam.
So, like, when we put love in as one of the Christian virtues and add it, does that dominate over fortitude? Because fortitude is the most dominant of the virtues, and not most dominant, but we tend to lean towards it.
Right, and so what love does is it tempers us in the best sense. It pulls us back and says, wait a minute, Sam may believe this thing that is absolutely wrong, but that doesn't mean Sam as a human being is wrong. We can't mess those things up. We can't confuse the argument for the person. And so that we tend to do that, and Congress is, they just yell at each other. Right? They're not really doing much. There's no real dialogue. And what you can say is that for a lot of congressmen, they have a lot of fortitude, not a lot of love. And that seems to be true in society right now, for a lot of society. Yeah, Michaela.
So do you think if we get to that extent where we're twisting fortitude, we've almost lost the good that it's supposed to be promoting?
Exactly. So it becomes one of those things that where we exaggerate it to such an extent that it becomes a god in and of itself. At that point, then we've lost the very good of what it was about. But it is an extreme. I mean, it calls for extreme measures sometimes. And those extreme measures, especially if you temper it with love, can mean self-sacrifice. So it has the ultimate cost at times. Yeah. Good. Okay, so does that make sense for everyone? All right. These are great things to know. I think they're just essential to understand Western civilization. All right, so let's look at Herodotus, and I'd love somebody to read this dialogue we have. Now, just in the background, I want you to remember Herodotus is our first historian in the Western tradition. So he's the father of history, but he is also absolutely a Greek patriot. So as we're reading here about these Persians, I want you to keep that in mind. Why is a Greek patriot writing about Persians, having this discussion? So just think about that. Okay, who'd like to read? Fiona, would you mind? Thanks.
And now when 5 days were gone, and the hubbub had settled down, the conspirators met together to consult about the situation of affairs. At this meeting speeches were made, to which many of the Greeks give no credence. They were made nevertheless. How do you say his name?
Otanes.
Otanes recommended that the management of public affairs should be entrusted to the whole nation. To me, he said, it seems advisable that we should no longer have a single man to rule over us. The rule of one is neither good nor pleasant. You cannot have forgotten to what lengths Cambyses,
Yep.
went in his haughty tyranny, the haughtiness of the Magi you have yourself experienced. How indeed is it possible that monarchy should be a well-adjusted thing when it allows a man to do as he likes without being answerable? Such license is enough to stir strange and unwanted thoughts in the heart of the worthiest of men. Give a person this power, and straightway his manifold good things puff him up with pride, while envy is so natural to humankind that it cannot but arise in him. But pride and envy together include all wickedness, both leading on to deeds of savage violence. Truth it is that kings, possessing as they do all that heart can desire, ought to be void of envy, but the contrary is seen in their conduct towards the citizens. They are jealous of the most virtuous among their subjects, and wish their death, while they take delight in the meanest and basest, being ever ready to listen to the tales of slanderers. A king, besides, is beyond all other men inconsistent with himself. Pay him court in moderation, and he is angry because you do not show him more profound respect. Show him profound respect, and he is offended because, as he says, you fawn on him. But the worst of all is that he sets aside the laws of the land, puts men to death without trial, and subjects women to violence. The rule of the many, on the other hand, has, in the first place, the fairest of names, to wit, isonomy, and further it is free from all those outrages which a king is wont to commit. There, places are given by lot, the magistrate is answerable for what he does, and measures rest with the commonalty. I vote, therefore, that we do away with monarchy and raise the people to power, for the people are all in all.
Read one more paragraph, if you don't mind.
Such were the sentiments of Otanes.
Megabyzus.
Megabyzus spoke next and advised the setting up of an oligarchy. In all that Otanes has said to persuade you to put down monarchy, he observed, I fully concur, but his recommendation that we should call the people to power seems to me not the best advice. For there is nothing so void of understanding, nothing so full of wantonness as the unwieldy rabble. It were folly not to be born for men, while seeking to escape the wantonness of a tyrant, to give themselves up to the wantonness of a rude, unbridled mob. The tyrant, in all his doings, at least knows what he is about, but a mob is altogether devoid of knowledge, for how should there be any knowledge in a rabble, untaught, and with no natural sense of what is right and fit? It rushes wildly into state affairs with all the fury of a stream swollen in the winter, and confuses everything. Let the enemies of the Persians be ruled by democracies, but let us choose out from the citizens a certain number of the worthiest, and put the government into their hands. For thus both we ourselves shall be among the governors, and power being entrusted to the best men, it is likely that the best counsels will prevail in the state.
Okay, that was really beautifully read. Thank you. Let's talk about this for a moment, and then I'd like someone to finish this up. But what do we have this? What's this debate about? What's going on here? Yeah, Michaela.
Discussing the system of government.
Okay, and what are the three forms?
So there's monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy.
Okay, right. So let's put it monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, right? So these are the three. So you have the one, the few, and the many are all being argued about here. And we're gonna have to put this into a little bit of context and give it a little bit of energy and try and understand how this becomes so important for them. But notice, this is the same debate the American founders had. Remember, I told you guys at Hillsdale we talk a lot about the American founders. So this is the same debate, right, that they have. And of course, they incorporate in the founding all three parts so that we have the one, we have the president, we have the few, we have the Senate and the Supreme Court, and we have the many, we have the House of Representatives. So all three are here. Now, why is it important that we have Persians making this argument? Sam?
Well, I mean, I don't know if this is an answer, but didn't they have like one god king as their ruler? And so they wouldn't really be talking like how the Greeks would, so it's kind of ironic.
Okay, what's the irony here? And what do you think Herodotus is trying to tell us? Why didn't he give this speech? It would have made perfect sense to have the Greeks talking about this. It makes almost zero sense for the Persians to be talking about this. Persians have a god king, as you said, and they don't really think beyond the terms of This is our ruler, and everybody else is subject. So why put it in the mouth of the Persians then? But the irony is correct, you're right. But why do that? Gwen?
Herodotus, you did say he's a patriot. Is he worried more about how his country and their form of government kind of show, being a democracy, which is at this time very, very rare, kind of shows to the rest of the world, and how maybe the Persians and some of the other rest of the world would perceive both democracy and other forms of government? Okay,
all right. And why, again, I think you're absolutely right, Gwen, but why is that so important for this dialogue? And just think about, I brought in the history that I read from briefly on Wednesday. It's a huge book. And out of that huge book, we gave you this. Rachel, you had your hand up. Did you want to comment on this?
I'm not sure, why he wrote it like this, but I was just thinking about something else.
Okay, do you want to comment now on your other thing?
That's
okay. All right. So let's think about this a little bit more then. If Herodotus is really a patriot, what does he think about Greece? It's the best, right? Greece is this tiny little place with 150 separate city-states. Persia is huge and monolithic. If the Greeks are so powerful in their ideas that they can get even the Persians to debate this, they can change the whole world. If the Persians can debate this, the world could be saved. Because that's how powerful this argument is. So that's why he puts it. And Sam, I think you were getting at this with the irony of it. But it's not just irony, it's triumph. The belief that, well, look, we can even make the Persians think in a way that they never would have done before. We've cracked that wall. We've broken down those barriers. So what we see here, and this is pretty important, what we see is that freedom of speech is a healthy thing for everybody. So for the Greeks being able to speak their mind, the Persians start saying, well, why can't we speak our minds as well? Why not? And so even if Persia lost the war, or let me put it a different way, even if Athens had lost the war against Persia, or if Greece had lost the war against Persia, they had still won to a certain extent because they had been able to convert them to their own set of beliefs. So, Michaela.
So, did this actually happen, or did this
No, probably not. Well, maybe,
okay.
But probably not. This is probably something that Herodotus just made up.
Okay.
And that was part of the convention of the time. It was acceptable because it may not be exact. And obviously, Herodotus wouldn't have been there. He wouldn't have been allowed to be privy to this. So he's writing a dialogue basically saying this is what could have happened more than anything else. But yeah, I don't think we should take it as factual history, but maybe, as we'll see here at the end, maybe. But that, by the way, that is an excellent question to ask. Really good. Those are the kinds of things we should be asking when we're thinking about these documents and trying to, especially thinking as historians, trying to understand how literally do we take these things or not. And obviously this doesn't have the power of Scripture, but we were trying to do that with Scripture as well. How literally do we take the 7 days? How literally do we take? So, these are important textual questions. So I very much appreciate that. Sam?
So if it's not literal, was it actually something that was happening within the Persian community, or was it just commentary?
Yeah, I'm no Persian scholar at all, so I'm speaking here basically next to myself rather than myself. But Persia's got a fascinating history. And I mean, these were an incredibly advanced people in terms of engineering, in terms of architecture, in terms of ideas, their economy. To make an empire is whether we like empires or not, and I assume you wouldn't really come to a place like Hillsdale if you liked empire. But whether we like it or not, it takes a lot to make an empire, and it takes a lot to maintain an empire. And their empire lasts for a very long time. With even the aristocracy there, the Magi, right? We're going to see them again in the Christ story. So there's some very powerful things going on in their culture, definitely, and we should take that, I think, seriously, even though they're not part of our Western tradition. They are the great antithesis. They're the great enemy. They are the Orient, right? They are everything we're not, but they are still really interesting. And one of the leaders before Xerxes and Darius was a guy by the name of Cyrus, and he actually was. He wasn't nearly as arrogant as Xerxes and Darius. Had a lot of things really to contribute to world society in a lot of different ways. Okay, that's my gushing for the enemy, but yeah, hopefully that. Okay, Gwen. Oh, I'm sorry, Michaela. Go ahead.
This is just a history question. So, if I think last class we talked about the Persian invading Greece, and the final invasion was in 479.
Right.
So, and then Herodotus, it says 44 to 425. So he had basically grown up with the Persians controlling Greece. Is that correct?
No. So the Greeks, when they invade, they are stopped. I'm sorry. The Persians, when they invade, are stopped by the Greeks.
Okay.
So what happens, and yeah, I should have probably explained this earlier. I'll just do it very quickly. What happens with Greece wins the Persian Wars. So the Persian Wars last from 500 to 479. That with the Battle of Thermopylae, and then there's another battle, Marathon, and the Greeks are able to win, and which is astounding in and of itself. And so a lot of what Herodotus is doing in his book, The History, is celebrating that win. The problem, and you can see where arrogance is going to come in here, the problem with this is that the Athenians become so puffed up with pride about what they did to the Persians that they start thinking of themselves as invincible. And they start treating the other Greek city-states in a horrible fashion. They tax them, they use their navy to regulate the other Greek city-states. And so you go from this moment where it should have been an absolute victory by the Greeks. The Greeks have just defeated the largest empire in the world, and they did so very successfully with far, far fewer numbers. And it's a brilliant moment. I mean, it's one of the great moments in all of history. One of the most important battles is Thermopylae in all of history. But then you turn around and Athens gets really arrogant about this. And so starting about 431, and I realize when we're dating backwards, it always gets a little confusing, but starting in 431, the Persians stay out of this for a bit, but the Spartans and the Athenians go to civil war against each other. That's what that's when you guys read Pericles' funeral oration. That's 2 years into this civil war. And that civil war between Sparta and Athens will last for almost 30 years. And it will end in Athens' defeat. So I would have gotten to this, hopefully I would have gotten to this at least by Monday. But Socrates is basically talking to a defeated people when he's philosophizing. Okay, I'm glad you asked that, Michaela. That's good. And I should have brought that up earlier. So, yeah, Anna.
What are the dates for the Persian
War
again?
Sure. Okay, so the Persian War, meaning Persia against all the Greek city-states, the Persian Wars are about 500. It depends on how you date it, but roughly 500 to 479. The Greek Civil War, that is between the Spartans and the Athenians, what's called the Peloponnesian War. Peloponnesus is the name of the peninsula where much of Greece is on. So you have the Peloponnesian War. That's from 431 to 404, and obviously BC, right, for these. So 431 to 404. And then that will end in the defeat of Athens. And Persia does come in and gets involved. In fact, Persia allies with Sparta, which is irony of ironies, to help defeat Athens at that point. Michaela.
Didn't the Spartans hold off the Persians, not the Athenians?
Yes, but the Athenians then have a battle at Marathon.
Okay.
So you've got these various victories going on. And Athens was one of the larger of the Greek city-states and had a lot of economic power. And we haven't talked any about this at all, but they were colonizing. So places like Syracuse, which is off the island of Italy, off the peninsula of Italy, Syracuse was a Corinthian colony. And so many of the Greeks were colonizing the Mediterranean. and Athens was one of the great colonizers. So Athens, for all intents and purposes, becomes a small empire after it's able to defeat the Persians. And clearly that is truly ironic that we'd have that happen. So, Sam.
I might be getting ahead of myself here, but we were reading in the history that after the Greek city-states were left weak, then obviously Mesopotamia took over. Did they spread the Greek thought in their empire, like Alexander the Great?
Yes, but we will definitely get to that.
Okay.
So, yeah, we will do a lot with Alexander. Okay. So he's still coming up.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's what we call. So we call this period in history the Hellenic period of history, meaning the Greek. We call that the Hellenistic, meaning it's Hellenic, but then kind of spread out in a different kind of way. So it's like Coke and Diet Coke in a lot of ways.
Gotcha. Okay.
If you think about that. So you've got the real thing, and then you've got the poor substitute. So, okay, let's finish this. This is great, guys. You're fantastic. So thank you. You're making my day, making my week. But let's go ahead and finish this, what we have. If somebody would, Quinn, you would raise your hand. Would you mind just finishing us with the last part of Herodotus here?
Yes, sir. This was the advice which Megabyzus gave, and after him Darius came forward and spoke as follows. All that Megabyzus said against democracy was well said, I think, but about oligarchy he did not speak advisedly. For take these three forms of government, democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy, and let them each be at their best. I maintain that monarchy far surpasses the other two. What government can possibly be better than that of the very best man in the whole state? The counsels of such a man are like himself, and so he governs the mass of the people to their heart's content, while at the same time his measures against evildoers are kept more secret than in other states. Contrariwise, in oligarchies, where men vie with each other in the service of the commonwealth, fierce enmities are apt to arise between man and man, each wishing to be leader and to carry his own measures, whence violent quarrels come, which lead to open strife, often ending in bloodshed. Then monarchy is sure to follow, and this too shows how far that rule surpasses all others. Again, in a democracy, it is impossible but that there will be malpractices. These malpractices, however, do not lead to enmities, but to close friendships, which are formed among those engaged in them, who must hold well together to carry on their villainies. And so things go on, until a man stands forth as champion of the commonalty, and puts down the evildoers. Straightway the author of so great a service is admired by all, and from being admired soon comes to be appointed king, so that here too it is plain that monarchy is the best government. Lastly, to sum up all in a word, whence, I ask, was it that we got the freedom which we enjoy? Did democracy give it us, or oligarchy, or a monarch? As a single man recovered our freedom for us, my sentence is that we keep to the rule of one. Even apart from this, we ought not to change the laws of our forefathers when they work fairly, for to do so is not well. Such were the three opinions brought forward at this meeting. The four other Persians voted in favor of the last. Otanes, who wished to give his countrymen a democracy, when he found the decision against him, arose a second time, and spoke thus before the assembly. Brother conspirators, it is plain that the king who is to be chosen will be one of ourselves, whether we make the choice by casting lots for the prize, or by letting the people decide which of us they will have to rule over them, or in any other way. Now, as I have neither a mind to rule nor to be ruled, I shall not enter the lists with you in this matter. I withdraw, however, on one condition. None of you shall claim to exercise rule over me or my seed forever. The six agreed to these terms, and Otanes withdrew and stood aloof from the contest. And still to this day the family of Otanes continues to be the only free family in Persia. Those who belong to it submit to the rule of the king only so far as they themselves choose. They are bound, however, to observe the laws of the land, like the other Persians.
Okay, well read, Quinn. So let's just finish with this. We have now monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and Otanes gives us the first glimpse of anarchy that we'll see in Western society as well by withdrawing here, which is pretty amazing that he's able to do this. And this is why when you were asking, is this real or not, well, we do know there was a person named Otanes, but it's most likely that Herodotus was just using him as a symbol here. All right, excellent class, everybody. Thank you. Make sure that you've read the Credo from Monday. I don't know if we'll actually get to it. We may spend our whole time on Pericles, but at least get up through the Credo and have that. And remember, it's hard. So try to work together, or at least think about it in a variety of different ways. All right, and I'll see you on Monday. God bless and have a great weekend.